Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. For this lesson, I picked a fun game where white, from a seemingly calm game, a queen-pawn opening, still develops an impressive attack and combinations. I hope you'll enjoy the game as much as I did. This game was played by Colle versus Gruenfeld back in 1926. And Colle used his own opening. d4, knight f6, knight f3, e6, and what Colle is famous for, or the opening that's called the Colle, starts with e3. Most typically, we refer to the Colle when black plays actually d5 in this position or in one of the previous moves. However, in this game, black decided to hold back that d-pawn, the reason being, so after black plays b6 and develops the bishop in a fianchetto way, the black bishop on b7 will not be locked up by a pawn on d5. This, on the other hand, more resembles a Queen's Indian defense type of position. Continued with b6, and white developed bishop d3. Of course, after b6, typically black would play immediately bishop b7, making sure white does not play e3 to e4 with the pawn and dominate the center. And white played knight bd2. And now this is a crossroad where black needs to decide what to do. Either to play d5, which would indeed transpose to the traditional Colle, where black prevents white from playing e4, however, with that, would lock up his own bishop on b7. Or, the way black continued, by playing c5. Now this puts pressure on the d4 pawn, and now white playing e4 is less attractive, as after pawns trade on d4, the white knight would be obliged to recapture. White prefers to have a pawn on that square. White castled, and black continued with bishop e7 developing. Here white could play c4 right now, or in the next few moves as white did. White continued with b3, very typical move for this position, and black still has the option to gain better control of the center, but he chose not to play d5, likes to see the bishop on a nice open diagonal, and traded on d4, followed by playing d6. I personally would prefer to castle first and kind of check out how white continues, and then push my d-pawn, perhaps depending on white's move. Because castle is certainly a move black will have to play rather sooner than later. On the other hand, there was no urgency to move the d-pawn. White played bishop b2. Of course, when you play b3, as soon as you can, you typically want to put your bishop on b2, making sure an enemy knight doesn't end up on c3 and cause trouble. Black played knight b to d7, and white finally decided to play c4. Typically, this type of position would arise straight from a Queen's Indian defense. And black castled. And now white has to choose a plan. And it's a wise idea to first choose the plan and then position your rooks accordingly. In such positions, it's always a dilemma which two of the three natural files should the white rooks occupy, or even four. The C, D, and E files are either semi-open or likely to get open sometime in the future. And potentially the rook could be even used on the F file if white would get to play f2 to f4 with the pawn and f5. So really white has a choice to put the rooks c1, d1, d1, e1, e1, f1, c1, e1. So all these combinations are certainly possible, and to some degree it's a matter of taste. Even at grandmaster level, we consider it one of the hardest decisions in chess to pick the correct two squares when there are three or more logical places to position the rooks. White continued by playing rook c1, preparing for the c-file opening in the future, and perhaps white was hoping to discourage black from playing queen to c7. Came rook e8, and white responded with rook e1. Certainly one of the rooks belong on e1. That's kind of a must, because that's pretty much the only file that is open from white's perspective. Apparently, black did not get scared enough and still put the queen onto the c file to c7. Of course, it's kind of hard for white to take advantage of this move right away. Nevertheless, a move like d5 certainly would to be considered because of the fact that even though black has a three-way attack on that pawn and only one white pawn is protecting it, because of the discovered attack after cd5, it becomes a possibility. And then if white could get a minor piece to c6, white certainly should go for this. Of course, black is not forced to capture on d5, but could push the pawn through to e5. But d5, e5, I would say certainly is an accomplishment for white and not for black. Let's go back. And now white continued with queen to e2. And black, rook a to c8, a very typical hedgehog setup from the black side, where black oftentimes repositions the queen to a8 to tie down white's knight on f3 in order not to lose the g2 pawn. And now white regrouped the knight with knight f1, and black indeed followed with queen b8 and came knight g3. White doesn't hide his intentions, is looking for a kingside attack. And came queen a8. A fascinating position where both sides have balanced play. And white here played very aggressively knight g5. Now black has to be very careful what to play and had to be on a watch out for white's possible sacrifices on f7 or at times even on e6. Capturing the pawn on g2 would not be a wise idea because white could do a disconnect between the black queen and bishop by playing d5, and all of a sudden black's bishop is trapped. Going back a move, instead of bishop takes pawn on g2, knight f8 certainly looks like a logical option. However, then white would get an advantage by playing d5, opening up the dark squared bishop in a very powerful way. Now, for example, if black would try to win the pawn by simply capturing it, and now rook takes c8, queen takes c8, and bishop to b5. If bishop c6, queen c4, and all of a sudden the problem comes on f7. Queen captures f7, king h8, and rook takes bishop with white's advantage. Let's get back to the game after the knight g5 move. The best response right now for black would be to play d5, preventing white from opening the dark squared long diagonal by white himself pushing the pawn from d4 to d5. The second best option would be to play bishop f8 and then to keep black's light squared bishop's diagonal open. However, now the black rook sufficiently protects the key e6 square. Instead, black made a mistake by playing g6. G6 on one hand prevents ideas of white doing something on h7 and also prepares the regrouping of the bishop to g7, which indeed is something typical to do. However, most of the time you do want to do that by first moving the bishop to f8 and then opening the little window with g6, so right away the move after you could put the bishop on g7. Pretty much for a reason to avoid situations that you're about to see. Right now, white could play d5 again right away, but instead white is ready for action. Knight f7. A very nice sacrifice. King captures back, and queen captures on e6. Now the king has two options. Black chose to go to g7 in the actual game. Let's check out what would have happened if the king went to f8. d5 again is in the picture to make sure our bishop is fully participating in the attack. Knight c5 and queen e3. Not only protects the bishop on d3, but prepares action with queen h6. Knight takes d3, queen takes d3. One of those situations when white is not in a terrible rush because they do have two pawns already for the sacrificed piece. Also, the black queen is completely out of play in the corner and very far away from the king side, where the black king would be in need of help. And if now comes knight d7, then white is ready to double the rooks with rook e6, not even being scared of the fork with knight c5, because queen d4 would come with nasty checkmate threats, and after knight e6, d takes e6, black is hopeless against the above-mentioned checkmates. Let's go back. As I mentioned, after queen e6 check, black in the actual game moved to g7, not to f8, most likely in hopes to keep that f8 square open for the knight, which could then kick back the white queen. But as we're used to it already, white plays d5 again, opening the diagonal of the bishop on b2, which now in turn pins the black knight to f6. Now if the knight would move to e5, trying to make a disconnect there of the white bishop's pin, and now in addition to being able to capture with the bishop, it's even more precise to capture with the rook on e5. And if pawn takes back, queen takes, and for example, if queen b8 trying to trade queens, then white would follow up with a third sacrifice with knight f5 check. If pawn takes, now queen f5, threatening with queen h7 thanks to the pin along the long diagonal. King f7, rook e1, with a pretty impressive attack, now threatening to capture on e7 and then the knight on f6, bishop d8, and rook e6. Rook e6, pawn takes, king e8, bishop f6, bishop f6, queen f6, threatening check followed by checkmate, queen c7, and a nice, quiet, and powerful bishop e2, giving white a winning attack. Such variations are of course very hard to see all the way through. You just have to have a trust, a belief that the attack will work out. Why? Because all your pieces are in play, attacking, you have some material compensation to start with, and your opponent's pieces are away from defense. This variation is just a sample line, and there may be other options for white as well, and of course black may play differently too. It's just an illustration which direction white should be going. In the game, black continued with knight c5, forking the white queen and bishop. This is one of those situations when even though you're being attacked, you don't need to retreat. When all the pieces are actively positioned while the opponents are not, and their king is certainly in a suspicious position, look for opportunities to cash in and push aggressively. In addition to white's move in the game, also moving the knight to h5 with similar thoughts was a good idea. Knight f5, now if pawn takes, queen takes back, with similar threats as in the last variation. Now, if black would capture, things even get worse because white can immediately sacrifice on e7, followed by bishop takes f6, king f8, take the rook, and then take the pawn, and then finally take the knight. At the end of this, white has 4 pawns for the bishop, and black's pieces are still all misplaced with the queen in the corner and the bishop being stuck on b7. Let's go back and see the end of the game. Black did not capture the knight, but moved out of the check with king f8. And now a smart move, queen e3, threatening with a 2-move checkmate with queen h6 and g7. Now, black didn't have much of a choice but to capture the knight finally. And indeed, the queen arrived on h6, check. King moved to f7, hanging on to the knight. And now, rook e7, of course, is a good choice, but bishop f5 is even simpler and more powerful. Now the black rook is hanging, but a whole bunch of other things as well. Still rook takes e7 in the air, or just simply bishop takes f6 and then the pawn on h7. Just plenty of threat. Black played bishop d5, typical in defensive situations when the side that has material advantage wants to return some of that material in order to activate some of the pieces. But now, white doesn't even bother capture back, but continues with yet another sacrifice. Rook e7. Rook e7, queen f6, king e8, queen h8, king f7, and simply bishop c8. And black resigned because white is simply up 2 pawns and more to fall. A very nice attacking game by Colle. What's the moral of the story? Well, when your opponent makes a move like knight g5, certainly be suspicious that you may need to make a defensive move. And it's not the time to further weaken yourself on the king's side, like black did in this game by playing g6. With white, of course, it gave us wonderful ideas on how to position your pieces ideally for the attack. Hope you enjoyed the game. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this position, I suggest you take your time and try to figure out the solution on your own before you listen further to the answer. Black seems to be doing well having a queen, but we can already see a suspicious thing, namely that the white bishop and the pawn are on the same diagonal with the black queen. What that means is that if the white pawn would have the opportunity to move away with a check, that could be a discovery. Of course, this was a huge hint that white should be provoking the black king to go to a square where it could be checked. With the move rook d5, now if the king captures the rook, obviously c4 and black's queen will become history. If the king moves to b4, skewer comes with rook b5. But of course the black king can move back also. Now a different discovery is in the making. Bishop e4, very powerful. White simply threatens to move the rook to d1, And the black queen has trouble finding a hiding place from the multiple threats of the rook. For now, black can escape successfully by hiding on b2. Now, of course, after rook b5 check, the king can capture the rook and save the queen at the same time. And now, very cute little move, c3, renewing the threat. But the queen can hide further. Queen b3. And amazingly, now simply c4. The queen can no longer hide by moving to b4 because then rook b5 is already on a protected square by the pawn on c4. But what happens if queen takes pawn? Well, then simply rook d4 is the correct solution that wins the game. Well, I hope you enjoyed this cute little study that focuses on the discovery. Thank you for listening, and so long until next week.